Hey, you all, Farmer Jesse here. Welcome to the No-Till Market Garden Podcast, episode 37, season 2. Great last episode of the season and a bonus episode at that. This week I got on the phone with Jackson Rolett of Stonehouse Market Farm in Scottsville, Kentucky. Jackson is the co-creator of No-Till Growers. He has been helping me since the beginning and worked for free for several months to get the website up and running, and has helped organize events and just a ton of stuff behind the scenes. And this podcast and the website would not be what they are without him. But Jackson is also a really great vegetable grower there at Stonehouse Market Farm, which he runs with his wife, Jordan. And I wanted a chance to sort of tell that story and get some insight on what it has been like for him going from a relatively conventional background to a no-till farm. We get into a lot of good details on their different practices. We reflect a bit on the season of the podcast, and we talk about the future of no-till growers and a whole lot else. But before we get into it, I have some things to cover. First, though, I do want to say a big thank you to BCS America, to Farmers Web, to Growing for Market Magazine, to Soil Food Web, and to Tilth Soil for all their support this season. This episode is a bonus episode and only has one official sponsor. It's you. You who have donated via Patreon or Venmo or however else. This is a bonus episode for you to say thank you for the season. Thank you for going out of your way, literally stopping what you're doing, going to a website and kicking us a few dollars. Like, that action is huge. Even if it's a couple bucks a month or just a couple bucks overall, it's been huge for us. So this episode is a thanks for that. But as an additional thank you, Jackson and I are going to be putting up bonus material all summer on the podcast feed. Yeah, the second season is over, but there will be really nerdy, detailed content coming out all summer as we lead to the third season of the long-form interviews with farmers. Jackson is going to do some of these summer shorts for me to sort of take the pressure off while I'm farming full-time. In fact, it was kind of his idea as we were debating how to provide value this summer. So that will be fun to hear a different perspective from the interview side. These will be shorter by about half or more and hyper detailed around single subjects. There will also be a wide range of people interviewed, from composters to scientists to agronomists. There are so many questions we still have, so that's what we're going to be doing this summer, seeking those answers. So huge thank you to our Patreon members and Venmo donors for making that possible. Anyway, that's good for now. So let's get into this really awesome conversation with my good friend and No-Till Growers co-founder, Jackson Rolett of Stonehouse Market Farm. Jackson Rolett, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It feels very strange to be sitting on this side of it.
It's about time. So, all right, you have to start where everybody else does. Tell us about the farm, where you're located, how much land you're working on, and those sorts of things.
We are in southern Kentucky, so we're right across the state line from Tennessee. That's, about as far southern Kentucky as you can get. Officially Zone 7 now. We have just under 10 acres to our farm. Only a half of it is in cultivation. The first year here at our new farm, at our new location, we had an acre, and then we shrank back down to a half acre, and we do that in your traditional market garden setup. So we've got just over 80 50-foot by 3-foot beds that are set up on a permanent system. Mostly using hand tools to prepare ground, silage tarps, broad forks. We have one 30 by 150 high tunnel, and then two caterpillar tunnels. Again, we've got just over 80, about 90, 50 by 3-foot beds. And we grow year round. So 52 weeks of the year, minus 2 weeks at Christmas, we take food to market and have been operating at CSA. And we've been doing that for about the past, I guess, going on 6 years now. So whatever, 50 times, that's almost 300 consecutive weeks if you take out our Christmas break. of taking food to market and doing a CSA. We grow about 20 varieties of produce. We do a lot of the lettuce and the carrots and things like that, but then we also do some crops that are maybe not quite as profitable, but we still feel compelled to grow them. So a lot of garlics, cabbages, storage cabbages, potatoes, broccoli, cauliflower, things like that. We don't do them as often, but we try and keep our diversity as high as we can possibly manage and still profit from the farm as a whole.
Nice. So with those, I think you told me before that you were doing 36-inch beds, but I guess I didn't even know where that came from. Is that a recent change?
So we started, when we set everything up, we did the 30-inch wide beds. That was, a good tip from Richard Perkins. All of the tools are standardized really for a 30-inch bed, and it maximizes the use of your tools. And we did 18-inch pathways. And whenever I look out at our field blocks and say I've got beds of broccoli, that's an appropriate amount of space in between the beds. And, when you've got leaf coverage, you've got a lot of coverage, and that comes out into the aisles, and that feels appropriate. But then when I've got beds of carrots or beds of spinach or beds of lettuce, I look out through there and I look at the aisle, I don't need that much aisle space to function. So when I was doing the math, we can fit an extra row of carrots in a bed, an extra row of head lettuce in a bed, extra rows of radishes, extra rows of arugulas, and I could still get the spacing where I want it without cramming it in there too tight. And so we'll still do, say, on our broccolis or our larger cabbages, we'll still do 2 rows. It also leaves us a little more wiggle room in terms of interplanting. So I can hug the shoulders better with head lettuces, or maybe rows of carrots on the outsides of beds instead of having to cram it all in a 30-inch bed. So I feel like it gives me a little more flexibility. Right now I've got double rows of peas in a caterpillar tunnel, and then I've got full-size head lettuce and rows of beets down the side, and everything has plenty of room. So that's why we pushed everything out to 36 inches. Is for a lot of the smaller and the direct seeded crops, I can get another row in just to fill that space out. And I have fewer pathways. Your pathways don't generate any revenue for you, so I'm trying to make the most of my space as I possibly can.
Yeah, that's great. It's funny because I've been thinking a lot about how much I kind of don't like the 30-inch bed system, or just 30 inches. Like it has a lot of limitations, but I set up our pads at 14 inches, so I don't really have that option of kind of shrinking them, and I really regret that. I feel like if somebody's setting up a garden, they should really think about bed width.
Sure. And it doesn't, I am not as precise as other growers in terms of the definition of my beds. So whenever I'm broad forking, even when I'm broad forking with the wider Johnny's broad fork, we have the Johnny's and the Meadow Creature. I'll stagger those, and I'll broad fork out into the aisle at least 3 to 6 inches, because your root zone does not stop at the aisle either. So I also want to make sure, yes, we're going to be walking on those aisles, and eventually I would like to mulch the aisles. Compost creeps out into the aisle, and so do your roots. And so I want to free those up as well. But yeah, the 3-foot wide bed and the 12-inch walkway, as our beds creep out, we did start on the 30 inches. And then seeing those 18-inch pathways, it just looks like you can grow more food. It looks like a lot of bare ground, or a lot of unused space. Now I'm also on the taller end of the spectrum, and my wife is not that tall. Everybody that I've had come to work on the farm has also been pretty tall. So reaching across a bed, a 3-foot bed, to get to the center or even to the other side when harvesting, it's not a big deal for us. Or straddling a 3-foot bed is not a big deal. I'm also not big on absolutely never, don't ever step in a bed. If we're harvesting, and if it's ergonomic to maybe put a knee in the bed to be able to reach the side, like in, say, a caterpillar tunnel. You can't get on the other side of that caterpillar tunnel in the middle of the winter when it's cold to harvest spinach. You can drop a knee in the bed to get to the other edge of the bed to cut it. So, I would rather have a 3-foot wide bed and do that than a 30-inch bed and worry about getting across it.
Well, have the tools, now that I'm thinking about it, like you said in the beginning, like all the tools are, kind of standardized at 30 inches, rakes and those sorts of things. Have you noticed that being a problem?
Not particularly. When we're raking out compost, we have the 30-inch Johnny's bed rake. When we rake out compost, I like to put a lot of pressure on the head of that rake, and it'll move it out into the aisle a little bit. We're usually making 2 passes up and back with the rake anyway. We're rarely ever making a single pass of anything. And then on the beds that are coming out to 36 inches, when we say run the gritter, I really like the gritter. So on the 4x gritter, like we use for salad mixed lettuces or beets or what else? Spinach. So say if you use the 4x and you run it, you can run it down the edge of the bed, and then you can into it where that 5th row is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
So if you've got 4 rows going down a bed, you just hug the left or the right side of the bed, and then you know where that next row is. And then when you start to use things like the wire weeders or the collineal hoe that is set up for the spacing of that gritter, it still works. It's not like you're sitting on a tractor and using those implements where it has to be precise or you're going to lose plants. It doesn't take that much effort to get a little creative on taking 30-inch width tools and making them work on a 36-inch bed.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's great. I guess that's something I wouldn't have thought about until I was working on it maybe, but not running the gritter right down the middle, but actually running it off to the side and then intuiting that last row. That's pretty smart. Tell us, all right, so I want to hear a little bit about your sort of journey into no-till, because it's definitely different from mine, and I think probably different from a lot of people, but probably not dissimilar from a lot of people as well. So talk a little bit about how you got into farming and what your first farms you were working on were like.
So my wife and I got into farming by accident. We and I guess a lot of first generation farmers kind of happen upon it by accident. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think a lot of us as kids wanted to be farmers, because as first generation farmers we weren't on farms. So we got out of school and had some options on where are we going to go with our lives, and we thought, well, we're going to stay home and get involved in the communities that we grew up in. And at that point, we're going to a farmer's market quite often, reading about local food and how it's good for the environment and on, and got connected with a farm in the community that was doing a lot of just absolutely amazing community engagement and local food access work. And so we got plugged into that farm's work at the market, doing things for the market, working on food access programs, and then started actually getting involved at that farm and realized that we much enjoyed our time at the farm working and that sort of labor than we did our regular jobs. And so we decided, well, this is a direction that we want to go with our lives and with the future of our family. Yeah, at that point, we didn't have kids, but we really liked the actual work of growing food and taking it to market and the community involvement around that. And I don't know, I'll preface everything I'm about to say with, I don't know that we could have been connected to a better farm for that to happen. Because as our family grew, they were very accepting of, when we brought the baby over, they were right there alongside us doing our work and whatnot. It wasn't like an 8 to 5 sort of internship or job. But as we slowly transitioned from our jobs to this farm, space was made on the farm for us to begin our own CSA with the produce that we all grew together, which was an amazing opportunity. Now this is what is now like a 20-acre plasticulture, tractor-based, a lot of tillage involved sort of operation. And this is the way that we were introduced to growing food. And we knew that there was a lot of plastic involved. I wouldn't necessarily call the farm that we began on completely conventional, but also, not organic. And we thought that, this was as sustainable as it could be to be profitable and actually have, a median income or parity of income. But it also wasn't a particular style of growing that resonated with us. I did not like to spend time on the tractor. Didn't particularly enjoy all of the single-use plastic involved. It was appealing at the beginning of the season when you could just plow and till and wipe a field clean like a blank slate. But at the time we didn't understand, and there wasn't a lot of information, at least to us, about how the negative effects of tillage over time. And at about that time, we had also picked up The Market Gardener by J.M. Fortier. And this was just a completely new way of growing. We hadn't heard of Elliott Coleman. We hadn't heard of market gardening. And just another way to be a small farm and another approach that was a much more suited to our strengths, to where we wanted to go with our farming. We wanted to, they say you can't farm organically in the South, and we repeated that. That's just what we understood. That's what we heard at the conferences. That's what we heard from fellow farmers. You can't farm without pesticides, herbicides, and fungicides in the South and make a living. And slowly we started to, in doing our own research, find that might not be the case. So when we started farming on our own and had our own leased ground, we started doing a lot more research into not only some of the things that we were accustomed to using and seeing their potential toxicity or carcinogenic effects. There are websites you can go to that give the entire profile of these chemicals like neonicotinoids and how detrimental they are, whether or not they're detrimental to consumers or even to fish and wildlife or the farmer, like how hazardous are they to the people that are actually using them. And that was a concern for us. We had children that, loved to run through the rows, and we didn't want them to not have to, we didn't want them to not be able to do that. We didn't want that personal exposure to those things. And now we're finding out that using those things has negative repercussions on soil life. It's like a ripple effect through the soil. But at the time, we didn't know that. We just didn't want them around us. So eventually, we got our own leased ground, and we foolishly set up an entire acre of beds for just my wife and I to take care of with 2 children. And that was just too much ground to cover, because we still relied heavily on a lot of tillage. So it was a lot of rotary plowing. Every time we flipped over a bed, we used the rototiller and completely reset the bed, and couldn't figure out why we couldn't get rid of our weeds, and couldn't figure out why our soil was nice and fluffy one moment, and then there would be a heavy rain, and we would come back to it and see signs of compaction and slowed growth and some of the greens that we were growing. So we knew conceptually that this market garden approach worked. We were seeing it work all across the country. I mean, Instagram's a good place to see that, but couldn't figure out why it wasn't working for us, and started asking a lot of questions, even of the market gardening approach. What was it about what we were doing that wasn't working, particularly for our soil type and our climate? And then around that time, we were hearing on the Farmer to Farmer podcast, we heard the Singing Frogs episode, right? Unfortunately, right there towards the end. And that was just a light bulb moment. Before that, there was, and I'm blanking on his name. You know who I'm talking about.
Patrice Grau.
Yes, Patrice. That episode. We went back and listened to that episode. Like, it had completely slipped through the cracks. I listened to it, but then listening to it again after hearing Singing Frogs, wait, there's yet another layer to this. And that's when we really started exploring no-till. Was the strict, market garden approach was just not working for us. And so we shrank the size of our farm from an acre down to a half acre once we moved to this new farm, and then started implementing a lot of these no-till approaches. And finally, after 5 or 6 years, it seems like we're farming. It seems like we're not. Our land is not worse off every season. It's showing signs of getting better. We've only been quote unquote no-till for, I guess, 2 years now. But we're already seeing, better water penetration and, less pest pressure, better plant vitality, especially in the later stages of growth, without having to side dress or add supplemental nitrogen or anything like that. So that was sort of the arc. It was we only knew what we were exposed to, which was a big tractor, heavy tillage, and plasticulture, and that was the consensus down here in the South. Was that was the only way you were going to go produce and make any money. And slowly it was taking that model apart. And breaking it into smaller pieces and realizing, well, we don't have to have a tractor and we don't have to have 5 acres in production at a time. And eventually we don't have to use tillage. And now here we are, If I could back up for a second, one of the things that I wanted to cover in that last question, I think I got a little far field there, was I knew that the way that we were growing initially was profitable, but it was not working, if that makes any sense. Farms that were farming in that capacity were profitable, but their farms were not getting better strictly because of their practices. And that was concerning to me when I started thinking, well, what if we farm this way for the next 30 years? It didn't seem like something I wanted to do for the long term. And the food was getting to market, but it was increasingly challenging to manage. And so I really started looking for ways to farm in which the farm got better at producing food as food was produced on it. Started researching, after that Singing Frogs episode, started researching singing frogs. And as we started the podcast, it was, and I think the idea was, hey, let's call some of these people and figure out this thing called no-till in this context. What is going on here? Because it had just blown my mind that it was even possible. And then it was, these are conversations that farmers have with each other. Why not record it and put it up on the internet? I call local growers here all the time for locally specific issues, and we have these conversations about the weather or about what you're doing for this pest that's automatically shown up in the past week. But then hearing these conversations that you've been having with these growers and whatnot, I really like what Cliff Davis said about taking some of these ideas that particularly resonate with you and just implementing them on the farm and seeing what pays off. What is it that resonates with you that fits your fit your growing style or your context or even your personality, and put those into place, and see what works.
And I liked that profitable but not working thing. Like, I think that maybe that's something that people don't always evaluate in themselves and in their systems. There have been times where we've been completely overwhelmed by work, and just making money but not feeling good about it, and not feeling, and especially like, when we were doing a lot more soil work and working a lot more with the tractor, and it was loud and it was physical, like moving that power arrow around all the time. It was like it was working, but it wasn't working. And I think that's a really great way of putting it. I'd love to hear kind of like, since we've started this podcast, and done no-till growers, which was really, you were definitely the inspiration for that and have done so much of the muscle work on it. What are some of the things that you've kind of taken during that experience, like doing the research and helping me with the podcast and everything, and been able to apply to your farm?
What have I been able to apply? I've wanted to apply all of it. And I think that's the hard part, is with every guest, it gives you something, another rabbit hole to go down. And sometimes you've got to put the blinders on and say, okay, I've got to really evaluate my context, and I can't experiment too much because, you still have to get food on the table. But I'll go back and listen to some episodes a second time and find what really, really flipped a switch for me, or sparked something that I was really excited about, and not just something else to look up. And one of the things that I've gleaned from maybe several episodes together is that this is all possible on a human scale. You can grow a tremendous amount of food without a tractor, or maybe without a tractor as a primary implement. And one of my favorite episodes is still the first one with Daniel Mays. I think Fritz Farm is one of my favorite farms to pay attention to, in terms of the ability to cover a lot of ground and grow a lot of food. And if you took the tractor out of the equation on that farm, I don't know that he still wouldn't be able to do what he does. Because one of the things that I didn't particularly enjoy, like I said, was the tractor work. It was loud. It was sitting still. I didn't particularly get into farming to sit in a seat. I like moving. I really enjoy broad forking. I like the human scale aspect of it. And so a lot of these farms that are working on a human scale, I try to really pay attention to how they do things. Like I said, using a broad fork, I don't ever see that as, oh, I've got a broad fork. I see it as an opportunity to not only do something for my soil that needs to be done because we're working with a heavy clay, but then that's exercise. That's me getting a workout. That's my body being better at the end of the day because I have broad forked, and then I've done what I needed to do for the next crop as well. Some of the other things that I've been particularly influenced by, let's see. It's been 2 years, and this podcast has covered so much ground in 2 years, and the work we've done on the website has covered so much ground in 2 years. And I think one of the things that I appreciate most, and something that we've worked really hard to do, was to maintain a non-dogmatic space. Because where this all started was, these people are not tilling and their soil is getting better every year. And I don't know, you probably couldn't told us this at the time. I don't know that it wasn't not tilling that was what we were interested in. It was, these are small farms who are doubling down on the ecological health of their soil and are profitable. particularly for me up until this point, you either have one or the other and not both. And that is what has been really striking to me, is that you can have both. But it is going to, at least for me, it is going to challenge a lot of your preconceptions of what you think is healthy or appropriate for your soil. That you can manage cover crops without using a plow, or some of the ideas about photosynthesis being your best fertilizer. It's those things that have started to unlock doors in my thinking that I really need to constantly challenge my preconceived notions of what I think this farm should be, or what farming is, what is appropriate technology, or what is appropriate use of input. Because I usually hear something, at least on every other episode, that's challenging. So I think that overall has been what is helpful to me. I come from, we started in a fairly conventional environment in terms of farming, and so it's every week, because we're not just doing the podcast and running the website. It's like we're running across all of this information, and we're combing the internet, and we're looking at all of these farms that are doing this work, and I'm still surprised at how much food they're producing per acre, and how they're going about doing it. And the ones that surprise me the most are the ones that are growing a lot of food without tractors or without mechanization, and using their bodies and using human scale appropriate technology to be able to grow all of this food is what has stood out to me. And it seems like when you remove the tractor, it opens up doors. It's like self-imposed limits. I always think about, I feel like one of the inflection points between me and you over the past several years has been when we went to see JM speak. Do you remember that?
Yeah, what was that, like 2014 maybe, in Lexington?
Yeah, we went there, and I feel like that was like a switch flip for both of us, and sent us inevitably to here, to where we are now.
Yeah, I agree.
That you can impose, and what I took from that was you can impose limits on yourself. They don't have to. You don't have to farm in a conventional manner, however you define conventional. You can impose a limit on yourself, and surprising things will happen. I mean, I could open up 3 to 5 acres of ground on this farm and put it in plasticulture, but we have imposed these limits on ourselves, and per acre, I'm growing way more food than I ever have. And, from the results of soil tests and my own observation, the ground is getting better. It's improving. Instead of at best maintaining itself, at worst degrading or eroding. And I still, I almost still don't want to believe it. It's strange. I almost still don't want it to be the case, because this ecocentric, or this, what we call no-till, we really mean like the 4 principles of soil health. Gabe said it in the last interview. Follow the principles of soil health. Just follow the principles of soil health. It's going to look different on every farm. Follow these principles. You will grow nutritious food, and your farm will improve. But it requires so many more demands on the farmer's power of observation and resourcefulness. And where I come from, in terms of a more conventional approach, it was all very prescriptive farming. It's this many pounds of fertilizer. It's this many feet of plastic. It's this many plants at this spacing. It's this fertigation schedule. It's this spray schedule. And that is very reassuring. You know what to expect. I think that even conventional farming, it's still one of the hardest jobs in the world. And then from my point of view, all this has done is take that away from me. And now I am relying on my own interpretation of what is ecological farming, and then my own observation and sort of the call and response of my farm in particular. I didn't come from an organic background, so sometimes I don't even know what I'm looking at because it's so different. And sometimes I'm pleasantly surprised, and then sometimes, like, I lose 3 subsequent crops of cucumbers because I just feel at a loss. Where's the answer? I have this problem. Where's the answer? Well, in a past farming life, I had the answer, but now I'm unwilling to use that. Like, that's a self-imposed limitation I put on myself. I know this spray will cure this problem, but I'm not going to use it. And it's been really challenging and really frightening at times, to know that there are problems going on out there. And at one time I had solutions for them that I don't now. But then at the same time, I'm seeing some of the problems that I did have, I no longer have. So it's both exciting and terrifying at the same time. To have shifted gears is hard. I mean, over a span of 4 years, we went from plasticulture to a half acre and no-till produce. And it's every year is more terrifying and more exciting than the last.
Hey, you all, quick interruption from me. Just to remind you that if you appreciate our work and want to see it keep going and growing, be sure to sign up for our Patreon page at patreon.com/farmerjesse. Without it, we don't really have a podcast. It is the main funder of our work, but at a certain level, or if you just bump up from one level to another, you get a shout out on the show. So big shout outs this week to Eric Folda, John Martin Fortier, Kevin Keene, Ryan Gosser, and Yannick LaPlante. If our work brings you value, please consider signing up to be a patron at patreon.com/farmerjesse, or you can always just kick us a few bucks to @NoTillGrowers on Venmo to say thanks. All right, you're awesome. Back to Jackson.
I love this conversation because it has me thinking, like, if you could go back in time and ask Jesse and Jackson, like, before we started all this, what we thought we would be thinking right now. Like, I kind of feel like my impression of what no-till was an approach that eliminated the need for tillage and, like, some of the tractor passes and those sorts of things, but was, generally better for the soil. And now I think it just has become ballooned into such a bigger concept to me. That involves the ecology. Like, I asked for birdhouses for Christmas. Like, it's like become a part of my being, this idea of, like, stewardship, and that it's gone so far beyond just, like, not turning your soil over.
Right. Well, I mean, I think that's the entry point. And as much as I've come to I think the word you used was a little ambivalent. As much as I've come to dislike this term no-till, because I don't ever like describing anything in the positive, that is people's entry point. I feel like, that was our entry point. It was, oh, you can do this without tilling your soil and it gets better. Well, it's like, yes, but there are all of these other things that are wrapped up into that promote soil ecology. Like, that's step one, is reducing tillage. And then there's cover cropping. And then there's, arguably remineralization and adding compost and keeping the soil covered, and eventually in some circumstances incorporating animals. And it has gotten to be this entire new to me, and not just because of our work, but because a lot of people's work, like a whole new farming paradigm. And I feel like the people that are embracing it now, this is where my psychology background is going to come out. That's what my degree was in, which completely prepared me for farming, right? I feel like the people that are paying attention to these regenerative practices are, open to new experiences and more creative. And willing to try new things, and willing to look at the anecdotal evidence and say, this is worth trying. and yeah, it's become. I bought bird boxes like 3 weeks ago, and I'm seeing bluebirds and swallows, and I've never seen the field so full of birds, which is beautiful. And that's another thing. I never thought I would see so many bugs in the field. That was something that was a little, in retrospect, a little strange. It's like now I do see aphids, but then I also see ladybug larvae and green lacewing larvae and, all of the other things that control those aphids. And so it's become so much more than just not tilling, to the point where I don't even, I don't think that's as important anymore. I think the focus for me for no-till is, it's not never till exactly. It's tillage is not a given. It is a tool to be used when and where it is appropriate. And we've taken for granted that up until very recently, since the Green Revolution, I guess, or since even before that to grow food, you had to till. And we're proving that that's no longer the case. That doesn't mean that it isn't appropriate under certain circumstances, but it's not required. And that's another thing that I think, going back to that self-imposed limitation. If you say, well, I'm going to try to do this without tilling, what you may do is unlock a lot of other methods or approaches that actually benefit the soil. Instead of taking one step back to take 2 steps forward, you may just be taking 2 steps forward by removing tillage from part of your practice when and where you can. And I think as a movement in general, that's what's important. Remove it when and where you can. And also cover your soil as often as you can. Grow cover crops when and where you can. And then every year push that a little harder. And see how it plays out on your farm in real time.
Yeah, that principle, all those principles having that idea of as possible in them, as much as possible, I think is like the most important part of it is it's, do it as much as you can under your context. Expect that it's going to take perhaps a really long time to develop the right system for your farm, and that it's okay to do it in pieces and slowly. You don't have, I have a tendency to dive in, and I feel like in some ways that's been hard on our farm, but also like at the same time, I've learned a lot of lessons that we've been able to share. So yeah, don't do that. You don't have to do that. There's plenty of there's so many, like you mentioned, so many great people sharing their information, from Josh Satin and Richard Perkins and Kristen Leach and all just so many amazing farmers out there singing frogs, and Brian O'Hara's new book. And I know that Daniel Mays is going to be coming out with one in the fall. Just so much great information out there that it's not requisite anymore.
Yeah, and these ecological farms that are really bringing this to the forefront. When we started this, I thought, well, we're going to find maybe 5 or 6 farms doing this, and they're all going to kind of look the same, and then we're going to have to call all of them back again if we're going to make a season out of this. And as it turns out, all of these farms are wildly unique and different, simply because they've applied, a set of ecological principles to their farm. And the principles are all the same, but in terms of their call and response to their particular farm, their farms all look so different. And they've developed all of these creative ways to farm and then have their farms be better because of their farming. But yeah, they all follow, generally speaking, the same 4 ecological principles. Instead of a manual, it's more of here's a set of guidelines, and then see what happens over time. And that's another thing that I think I would tell myself was, this is just going to take time. Like, you can't stop tilling and then magically your soil springs to life and you aren't going to have to deal with another pest infestation or disease again. It just takes so much time to not only observe what's going on your farm and learn what to do with those observations, but then, for your soil to regain its vitality and for crops to perform better season after season. Like, it gets better over time. It's not like this is a magic potion that fixes all of the problems on your farm. That's another thing I think, from the very beginning, I thought, well, we'll just throw out the tiller and we'll broad fork and everything will be all right. And it wasn't. We're encountering new sets of problems, but we're definitely seeing the progress too, of it getting better season after season.
Yeah, we're the same way. And I think, like, a lot of times when you bring up, say, adding compost or, as a sort of as a growing medium, as a mulch, or cardboard or something, people talk about bringing in slugs or bringing in this or that pest. And yeah, you kind of run into new challenges. But if you trust in the system that, like, you're making such a dramatic change that, if you trust in the system and keep working on it, that it will ultimately rebalance itself. And you get to take part in that, which is always exciting. One of the most exciting parts for me. But yeah, I mean, I think that's a good thing for people to hear too. It's just that it isn't just, it's not a magic bullet. It doesn't just, like, change all of the things that you didn't like about farming, but it may get rid of the weeds.
Yeah.
It may give you less disease pressure. It may, reduce some of those things.
Sure.
Because that's been what my experience. Some things don't always go great, but then some things go so shockingly well.
Right. Yeah, I've never grown. I should have mentioned this in the beginning. We've got a heavy clay soil here. And I thought, there is no way that I'm going to seed carrots into no-till beds and get passable carrots. And I have never grown better carrots in the past 7 years. 6-7 years since I began farming. I have never grown better carrots. And around here, everyone said, you want nice, big, fat, straight carrots? Sink that tiller as deep as you can get it. And this last fall, I think that's when you came out and did that short video. The carrots that came out of that bed were the biggest and straightest, not only the biggest and the straightest carrots, so those are some of the first beds we really converted to no-till. So they, at that point, had been in no-till for 18 months, probably seen a succession of, I would say, 4 crops. I'm not looking at my crop map right now. And yeah, not only that, but those carrots that I pulled for storage over the winter, so we'll pull them all around the end of December and top them and clean them and put them in storage, lasted far longer than any other carrot that I had in storage. And I mean, when we pulled them out on into April, they were still juicy and crisp and snapped. And, I'd never grown carrots like that before. But, that's not saying all of our problems are solved, but we're definitely seeing things like that we are constantly surprised by. Just the improvement in the quality of the crops.
Give us the nerdy details on how you set those carrot beds up.
So to set carrot beds up, we've figured that broad forking is not required to grow good carrots, but it is required to harvest good carrots. We found that a good broad forking before sowing your carrots, they pull easier on the back end. And we like to grow carrots with nice strong tops anyways, so we'll usually choose a strong top variety. We like Hercules, which is a Danvers type. And then we'll do Boleros for winter storage. And I believe Yaya was another fall carrot that we grow. But Hercules and Bolero for heavy clay soil for the fall are definitely our favorites. to set those beds up, we would remove the previous crop, and from there go ahead and add our amendments. At the time, I believe we had switched over to our new amendment regimen, which is what we're using now. So we'll use a mix of feather meal and blood meal as a nitrogen source. We will use a little bit of supplemental phosphorus because we have switched from using a manure-based compost to basically just a leaf mold now. So if I could back up a second, when we set up our beds, we did use a manure-based compost on all of the beds. And then we switched over to a plant-based compost. And now we're working with primarily a leaf mold as a mulch. And I can get into that later, why we made those changes. So we'll amend it, feather meal, blood meal, supplemental phosphorus. Believe that crop was bone meal, copper, zinc, boron as needed. For trace minerals, we use azomite. I know some people on the coast like to use kelp. Around here, it's kind of hard to get, so we use azomite. Amend it per test recommendations. Then we will tilth that in. So we will broad fork, amend, tilth it in. And we tilth it because we want that amendment mixed in a couple of inches because we don't want that amendment to erode with the small amount of compost that inevitably erodes off of that. Because we have that heavy clay soil, we found when you get a deluge, what tends to happen is it will soak through the compost and hit that clay soil, and some of the soil will want to run out from under the compost, or the water, rather. The soil will slick, the water will run off of the top of that clay layer and take some of the compost with it. So we're trying to keep all of the amendments that we put in the bed and not see it wash out into the aisleways. And then we will cover that with a thin layer of compost, and then direct seed into that thin layer of compost. From there, we'll set up wobblers, the overhead irrigation, and we'll set our timers for our irrigation. It's just a simple, I think Johnny sells it. It's a programmable timer. I think they're DRAM, but I'm not 100% certain. We'll set that every day to go off for 15 minutes at a time, 4 times a day during the hottest hours of the day. And then I can assess if it's been particularly hot and dry. I might run it 1 or 2 more cycles in the evening or for 1 good cycle at night, just to keep the surface of that soil moist. What I'll also do is cover it with light row cover. That's sort of we use those now for germination blankets. So we'll take whatever ripped pieces of light row cover we have and spread them out over the bed and get them nice and wet. And that keeps that moisture in there as well. And as soon as we start to see those germinate, we'll remove the row covers and then still resume the regular irrigation schedule, 4 times a day, 15 minutes at a time during the hottest 4 hours of the day. So that was how we got our fall carrots to germinate. And again, we're sowing those at the beginning of August when it's brutally hot and brutally dry here in southern Kentucky. And we had surprisingly good germination with all of our fall sown carrots that way.
Did you say what your Jang setup was?
Yeah, so the Jang setup that we use, I forget the roller because we don't use the appropriate roller. There's a video that you have where you show the roller that you use, and that's the correct one. We'll find it and put it up with the episode. But I do 10 and 14, so it's not the closest setting on the Jang. It's not the 1/2 inch, it's an inch spacing. Because the roller that we use typically drops 2 seeds at a time. So it's not a perfectly singulated stand, but it works for, it's given us really good stands in the past, and I haven't seen any need to change it. But we do use the 10-14 gear ratio, which, like I said, is an inch spacing, but it's dropping on average 2 seeds per at a time instead of just one.
Is it a 20? The one that we use is the XY24. That's the one with the X hash in it. But is it the?
I believe it is the X20 or the it's either the X24 or the Y24, but it is the 24.
Okay, but it doesn't have the little X inside of the circle.
It's not the X. It's just the circular opening on the roller.
Okay, with 24 holes.
Right.
Okay, that's good detail. So, all right, so we've just this is definitively wrapping up season 2. So, what are we looking for in season 3? Like, what are our big questions? Like, what comes to mind when I say that?
The first thing that comes to mind with just my thinking on where our farm has come because of the information we've gotten from the past few seasons is one thing that I'm really interested in, of course, is cover crops function on a small farm, especially in ways that compost additions or amendment additions cannot function. So what role do cover crops play in building healthy soil that we can't simply supplement with nutrients or minerals or compost applications or whatever the case? Because I'm finding that's been something that I've been really drawn to, and that's something that a lot of people, I think, have a lot more questions about, is how to appropriately use cover crops to build soil in a market garden context or on a small farm context. Because with a large farm, you've got roller crimpers and you've got large machinery and you've got no-till seed drills and things like that, like Gabe Brown has. But then breaking that down into processes and implementation on our scale is something that personally I'm really interested in. But then I think, how much of what we are exploring and doing is our farms getting better from our direct action, and how much of it is us getting out of the way and allowing natural processes to take place. One of the things, whenever I see an improvement on my farm, I try and think of, besides maybe not rototilling or not turning the soil, what are some of the other explanations or what else is going on? I don't just want to say, oh, we didn't till that and it corrected itself. It's like, what's really going on? Elaine Ingham says we only understand 2% of what's going on in the soil in terms of soil life and soil interactions and chemical reactions and biological relationships. And I don't want to get too heavy here at the end. One of my favorite Wendell Berry quotes or things that he likes to talk about is what we do not understand, we are at risk of destroying, So it's what are these relationships in terms of what we're doing to our soil and how those relationships are changing or getting better, and how can we facilitate what's going on down there, so that we make our farms better and are not at risk of running a field or maybe something catching on that is actually detrimental to soil health. We would never advocate somebody not till if they were in a situation where it actually needed to be done to improve their ground or improve their land at a particular point in time.
I mean, I think about that too. Like, one of the things that you said kind of there at the end, just thinking about like a lot of these things I get really excited about, but I always have to make sure that, we're tempering them with being realistic and also like making sure that over time it's not detrimental. Because, there was the tillage itself is a paradigm that went on for years with people assuming that it was good for the soil.
Right.
And that it was aerating it and that, the crops loved it. And to a certain extent, at first they did. And at first they do. When you till up a new plot of ground, that'll probably be one of the best crops you grow. But yeah, that's something to be conscious of.
Oh, absolutely. Well, and we saw this when we, at least, on our farm, we started applying large amounts of compost as a mulch, which is not in and of itself a bad idea, but then you got to take into consideration what's in your compost. And then over time, how does this affect the surrounding environment? So when you've got a large amount of phosphorus in your compost, it's great to set up a garden with, but then you've got to adjust, which is why we switched. The next year we did a plant-based compost, and then we found a supplier of leaf mold. And maybe the compost as mulch strategy, beginning with something with a fair amount of phosphorus, is a great way to set up a garden for several seasons of success. But you don't want to keep overloading your soil with phosphorus. And so from that point on, it is not specifically the compost that is doing the most good for your soil. It's maybe the aspect of something being a mulch. And so when we switched to this leaf mold, we found that what we're doing is we're not overloading the soil with nutrients, but we are providing a mulch. And then the soil underneath that remains porous even after really heavy rains, whereas, a normal field with exposed clay is just going to slick and hard pan. Maybe not hard pan, but it's going to slick on the top. You're going to get, gullies or erosion, and then it's going to become like concrete. Whereas after a heavy rain, underneath this leaf mold is a mulch, and it's only on there, 1.5 inches thick. You can still reach your hand right down in that bed. So there's still a lot of gaseous exchange. There's still some earthworm activity down in there. So it's just being aware that just implementing one thing or just doing the same thing over and over maybe isn't you're going to have to readjust as you go, and you're going to have to keep doing what's working. And when it stops working, try something else.
Well, Jackson Rolett, as we wrap up the season, thank you so much for this conversation and for all of the ridiculous amount of work you pour into what we do.
Well, I wouldn't have a job if you weren't the one putting in all of the hours interviewing and editing and shooting videos. And, Josh has done some ridiculously amazing work. It's been I've just been glad to do the work, and to support you all in putting this information out there. And really, we just did it because we had questions, and we thought, well, if we're going to ask the questions, we might as well let everyone hear the answers.
Yeah, and I think we probably will keep going until we stop having questions.
Which may never happen. That's just farming.
Yeah, that's just farming. It's hard to do it if you're not curious.
Yeah, I mean that's been one of my main, one of my primary motivations is that you just can't get underneath. When I say regenerative farming, I really just say a farm that's doing its best to apply these 4 principles. And personally, I feel like there aren't as many farms that can truly call themselves regenerative yet. But everybody's getting more and more interested in implementing these 4 principles, but you just can't get underneath them. I mean, there's no bottom that anyone has found yet, because there's so many different ways to do them, and always so many questions to ask. Sometimes it just drives me crazy that I can look out into a field and see something going better than I've ever thought before. And when I keep asking that question, why is it getting better? Why is this happening? I can't get underneath it. I can't get to the bottom of it. We just don't know.
All right, if you enjoyed that episode, make sure to stay tuned after the credits. Jackson and I are going to keep talking a little bit about the future of our work and no-till growers and other big topics at least one other big topic we intend to cover. And be sure to follow Jackson and Jordan at Stonehouse Market Farm on Instagram and Facebook and all the places. We will hook it up with links in the show notes. Make sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you are getting it, so you will get our updates when the bonus material starts next week. Make sure to leave a review, but this week all reviews must call the @ and ampersand all season long. Seriously, how did I do that so many times without catching it? Big thanks to Jackson Rolett and Josh Satin for their help, and an enormous thank you to my wife Hannah for all her work and support. Thank you all for listening, for an amazing second season, for everything. You rock. Bye.
Well, I just thought, with respect to some of the things that I think about the future of the ecology of small scale farming and going forward, it doesn't expressly have to do with ecology or growing practices, but the changing dynamic of farmers working cooperatively is something that I think is worth touching on and exploring in detail, over the course of the next few years. Because I think that until recently myself, it's been, there's a farmer as an independent owner operator, and they will have laborers or interns or apprentices, and those interns and apprentices may go on to start other farms. Now I kind of see that, oddly enough, yes, we need more farmers, but as sort of not fully taking advantage of farmers working together. If you have two good farmers, who's to say that they can't cooperate in order to farm better? So, I think as much as the future of farming is small, regenerative, I also think the future of farming is cooperative. More so than any technological revolution, more so than any genetic revolution. I think the future of the health of small scale farming is going to have to include some sort of cooperative models. Be that five farm families on one farm, or something like Dan Breesbaugh doing up in Canada, which is just amazing. When he talks about having 2 months off a year or whatever the case. There could be, innumerable ways of how that takes shape on a given farm in a given context. But I think more people exploring farming alongside other people. Is it worth giving up some of that independence in order to have more farmers in one space? I know that there's a lot of the time I wish I didn't have to make every growing decision on the farm. There are definitely weak spots that I have and weaknesses that I have that I would love to sacrifice some of my independence in order to have somebody with another eye, at least, or another perspective, seeing what I'm doing or having more input or another idea. I think there's more strength to be found in that than being completely independent and making every decision yourself.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Obviously, we've talked about this a lot, but that's definitely something I want to explore more in coming seasons, because I think it's, I know I've talked about it a lot. There's something about having somebody else that has the same amount of, the sense of propriety, like the same drive to make the farm succeed. Working with that kind of person is it's a really special thing. I mean, that's like working with my wife, or for you, like working with Jordan. But adding more people like that in different combinations.
Mm-hmm. And it's not somebody who's going to go away in 2 years or a season.
Right.
They're going to be there, and they're going to have as intimate of a knowledge of that particular farm and its intricacies as you are, and a history with the place, and a developed sense of where that soil has come from, and like you said, shared propriety in the goals of the farm and what it's going to accomplish. And it would be really interesting to see that model play out over 20 or 30 years. to see what a farm could accomplish, and still everybody maintain a better quality of life. I mean, that's why we switched over to human scale methods and practices, and it's greatly improved. Our farm is a lot quieter because of it. I don't even like to use the BCS because it's loud and it's a gas-powered engine, and I'm not mechanically inclined. When it breaks, I'm not quick to fix it. I would much rather use a broad fork. It's quiet, and I feel like it improves our quality of life. And I think cooperative farming is going to do more for that in the future than any particular tool will.